will the research get us there? And particularly because grant pages are so limited, it's really important to pay attention to following each point you want to make logically from the one before. If you go off on a tangent, it not only confuses the reviewer, but it wastes a lot of valuable space. So keeping in mind a logical flow is really critical. And there are many things that you might have in your head that you think are wonderful and related to the general topic that you're talking about, but you really need to not get distracted by them and keep the logical flow of the argument going. Now, these points that I've been making are the same ones that you would need to do if you were writing an article for a journal. But the next set of issues, even though, of course, being as simple and clear as possible is important for writing an article, it's slightly different when you're writing a grant. So you need to decide what the key concepts are at the very beginning and decide on the key terms or phrases that you're going to use. And in an article, you might want to vary those phrases and say things in a slightly different way so it doesn't feel redundant. But in a grant, I tend to not do that. I tend to stick with the terms that I've worked a lot on figuring out and use them repetitively, even though it is repetitive, because it helps the reader to keep track of what you're saying and keep track of the central concept of what you're aiming at. And as I said just before, you have to have the logical flow, have every sentence follow from one another. And one of the ways that you can do that in a grant is also to keep track of the titles of the sections. So one of the things I always do when I'm writing a grant toward the end is to go back and look just at the titles of the sections and see, if I were a reviewer, if I could figure out what the contents were going to be of those sections, not just a general thing as in an article where you would say methods or results, but something more particular than that, that helps to guide the reviewer. Sometimes I underline key points, but I try not to do that a lot, only where it's really important. I see that sometimes people use that in a way that seems to me to be excessive, but for certain key points, it's really important to underline them to bring them to the reviewer's attention. It's helpful, of course, to have figures to emphasize primary findings, but I tend to use them very sparingly because they take up a lot of space. So if you're going to use them, it needs to be really critical and important in emphasizing the points you want to make. And then again, in order to help the reader, I develop a numbering scheme, which I'll show you an example of later on, that helps again to keep track of where things are in the course of the grant. So as you're writing a grant, one of the things that seems most important is to keep the review criteria in mind. Every type of grant has a different set of criteria. So a training grant, an R01, an R21, a U01, whatever, each one will have a different set of criteria from the NIH perspective, but of course for foundations and other nonprofits, they also have their own criteria in mind. So you have to keep not only trying to discuss the ideas you have, but trying to be sure that they fit within the criteria that that institution is looking for. And each institution will have information about those criteria. They're usually provided on a website. If you can't find them, there are usually people you can call to ask questions. And it's really important to be clear, because sometimes if you don't follow those criteria, your grants actually won't be considered at all, when it would have been considered if you had more clearly understood what the reviewers were looking for. Another thing that I do, and I urge other people to do, is to write keeping the page limits in mind. So more and more grants are shorter and shorter, and you write very differently if you write as if you have an infinite amount of space, as opposed to if you have 1 page or 2 pages, for example. And it's very hard to say less rather than more. It's much easier to be very digressive and to go around, you know, with many, many sentences. It's much, much more difficult to be very concise. So I urge people not to draft something as if it's going to be twice as long and then cut it down, because you really write it very differently. And that means with the page limits that you need to think at every moment, are there other places in the grant where you can get this information across without having it to be in the body of the text? So for example, in an NIH grant, I often spend a lot of time on budget justifications or the human subject sections, because that's where you can have a lot of detailed information that you can't fit in the body of the grant, and it's not perceived as trying to get around the page limits if you do it properly. So you have to try to think of what do you have to have in the grant so the reviewer will be able to follow the basic ideas, but can you send them to other places in the grant where there might be an opportunity to give them more information? And again, if anything is unclear about page limits or requirements of any sort, you really should get in touch with the agency. I have on this slide this note about appendices, because years ago, people used to be allowed to have a lot of information in the appendices, and the reviewers at the NIH started getting very upset with this, so that now it's almost impossible to put anything in an appendix. And so if you thought you could put something in an appendix and it turned out not to be allowable, then of course that would be a problem. So again, of course, as you're writing, there are not only general criteria for a grant, but there are very specific criteria for different types of grants.
Excuse me, Marilyn.
Yep.
I do have a question, if you don't
Sure,
mind.
sure.
Yeah, so the question is, can you comment on what info is best redirected to the human subjects or recruitment sections?
So what I tend to do is provide a very rough overview of what the criteria would be for, let's say, recruitment of subjects, or even details of the evaluations you're going to give them. But you can't have all the specifics in the body of the grant. There just isn't enough room. So then you can put all of that in the human subject section. When we get to, I have a slide showing the human subject section. And what I do is very rigorously follow the outline, the required outline, the required headings of the NIH. But then I find that people will accept if I put a lot of detail in there. And so that's what I tend to do. I hope that answers the question.
It does.
Okay, good.
Thanks.
So I just to say a couple of things about the general criteria for specific grants. Some of you may be thinking of writing K awards, and those have very different criteria actually from a standard R01. So in a K, the training plan is actually almost equally important as the research plan, and they have to be really integrated with one another. And very often what people do is they spend a lot of time working on the research plan. They don't spend enough time working on the training plan, and then that's a problem. You have to specify very carefully the roles of the mentors. You have to always be talking about how training is going to lead to independence. And as you would with a regular grant, you have to have pilot data that supports the proposed research plan. But in a K, timelines have to be much more detailed than in a regular grant. And letters of support are things that are critical, and there are actually requirements about what should go into them. And so they have to be written by you and not by the person, I mean, drafted by you and not by the person who's going to be sending them to you, because you know best what the criteria are going to be. In a regular research grant like an R01, of course, the research is central and has to be worthwhile, and it has to be more important than in the research plan in a training grant. It's not as if the research in a training grant is not important, but it's clearly aimed toward you answering a set of questions, but also leading to your independence, which is different from a regular research grant. And then, of course, as in all grants, you have to refer to findings in the field very fairly. You have to, of course, have really good pilot data. And more in a regular grant than in a K, I think you have to spend a lot of time talking about potential problems and limitations that might restrict your ability to conduct the work. Reviewers will always look for that. And other grants such as R01s, R21s, or U grants like U19s or P01s, multi-component grants, they also have their own independent sets of criteria. So you really need to pay a lot of attention to that. Just a couple more words about a K. The K consists of these sections that I have here: a candidate's background, the training plan with the mentors, and the training plan timeline, in addition to the research sections. And as I said, these all need to be thought through carefully and integrated with the research. So I encourage people, when they write their background, to have the very first sentence emphasize the research the person is going to be doing, and how their background leads to their doing that research. The training plan, of course, has to fill in gaps in prior training that would allow you to be independent. That's the purpose of it. You have to describe how each mentor will contribute to the work. I mean, sometimes people get a little carried away and have too many mentors, and it then becomes unclear why there are so many of them and what they're doing. And then the timeline, everything has to be doable. One of the big mistakes that people make in these Ks is to have too many courses, too many meetings, too many seminars, and reviewers pick up on that right away and will say that they think it's not feasible. So one other thing about criteria: recently there have been additional sets of criteria that reviewers are specifically from the NIH asked to review. One is the scientific premise. So does the research have a solid foundation? Have you made a good argument for the proposed project? The other is scientific rigor. So is everything done in a rigorous way? Subject selection, methods, statistical methods to avoid bias, the statistical plan. And now there are also sections about biological variables that you have to talk about. Additional special criteria that are often relevant. So as you all know, because we're talking about Alzheimer's disease and aging, right now the National Institute on Aging has a great deal of money. And if you want to increase the likelihood of getting funded, then you want to have access to that pot of money. But then what that means is that you need to make clear in your application how what you're doing is related to Alzheimer's disease and related disorders. So it has to be clearly stated in the abstract. It has to be clearly stated in the text, everywhere you can, because what happens is that once the grant gets reviewed, then separately the Institute decides whether or not you will fit in that pot of money. So it has to be very, very clear. And the same thing would be true for special awards from foundations, that you have to think what the special criteria are that are being looked for, and be sure that you try to meet them. So now getting to the more, what I think of as the more nitty gritty. One of the things I do all the time when I'm writing a grant is to keep trying to imagine the reviewers. Obviously, they're people who will be knowledgeable. They're selected for that reason. But because they're knowledgeable, they tend to be very busy. They tend to have multiple demands, and they tend to want you to be able to write something that's clear and easy to follow and gets to the point and doesn't go off topic. And so you have to think immediately about how you're going to tell them what the focus of the grant is. And I'll give you an example of what I mean in a few minutes. At different points along the line, even though you think you've been really clear, it's important to briefly summarize things at critical junctures. And again, I'll give you an example. I said earlier, I think that it's critical to have key issues and key phrases that will allow the reviewer to keep track of what you're saying. It's very, very important not to use jargon. I mean, there are terms that you maybe use on a day-to-day basis, or even within your field, are used on a regular basis. But several reviewers will look at the grant, not just ones who have specific expertise in your area. So it's really critical not to use jargon, and to think in advance about what might be confusing and figure out ways that you can clarify various points. And I mentioned earlier, sometimes that's particularly where I use underlining. And then you need to think about what the reviewer will think of are limitations and try to address them. So to the point that this was just raised about what you would put into a human subject section, there are lots of things that reviewers will wonder about how careful you are if you're doing human subject research. And you can address some of those things by showing how careful you are and what your thinking is in the human subject section. So again, reviewers are not only looking to see what the body of the grant is, but they're trying to figure out who you are. I mean, even if they know who you are, they're going to be judging your prior productivity. I mean, I've been working in this field, and people are still, when they look at a grant of mine, looking to see, have I been productive in the last funding cycle? Or if I have a training grant, or have my trainees been productive? So prior productivity is one of the critical things. And reviewers look very carefully at the care to which a grant is put together. And I think this is often something that people don't think enough about. So I typically say that a grant is like a promissory note. You're telling the reviewer what you want to do. You're asking them for the money to do it. They know that something might come along that might make you think you might do something slightly differently. And of course, if it's not a contract, you can do things slightly differently. But they want to have the comfort that you will be careful regardless of what you're saying you're going to do. They want to know that you'll carry things out well. And one of the ways they can make that judgment is the care with which you put the grant together. So if a grant is put together in a sort of sloppy way with lots of mistakes, then the reviewers are going to think maybe this person, that's how they do their research too. And letters of support are often helpful if there are certain issues. I mean, we're talking not about Ks where they're required, but if there are certain things you want to get across in particular, that's also helpful to support what you're doing. But of course, the primary question the reviewer is going to be interested in is what are the questions that you're asking, and also whether or not it's important. So a colleague of mine just got a review back on a grant, and it was very carefully written, but you could tell that the reviewers sort of weren't entirely sure that they liked this area of research in general and were looking for ways to complain about it. So it does have to be that you're choosing something that seems to be important. And then, of course, it has to be feasible. So do you have enough time to get the answers? Are the methods appropriate? Is the rationale for them appropriate? Does everything seem to be selected to what you're going to do in order to answer appropriately the questions that you've posed? So these elements that people are going to be looking for, as I was just saying, is a good track record, research questions, preliminary data, appropriate colleagues and mentors in a research area in particular, feasibility, and then resources and facilities. And if you're submitting a grant from Johns Hopkins, you're fortunate because the resources and facilities here are quite excellent and you can highlight them. But in some places that's not the case. So you have to think really hard, are the resources and facilities supportive of what you're proposing to do? So here's just an example of the beginning of the first paragraph of a specific aims from a grant that was funded. It was a K award. And the very first sentence was, of the specific aims, was how does vision loss affect the brain? So right away, you know what this grant is about. And then this individual said, visually impaired older adults have twice the risk of cognitive decline and are at increased risk of dementia as compared to those with normal vision. There are two pathways that have been proposed to explain this vision-cognition relationship. The objectives of the proposed research are to characterize the vision-cognition relationship in older adults with multiple rigorous measures of visual function, and to use longitudinal data to test the sensory loss consequence hypothesis. So right away, you've heard what the topic is. You've heard it's going to be done in older people. You know it's going to be related to cognitive decline. You've heard this phrase, vision-cognition relationship, and already it's been repeated twice, and it keeps on going through the grant because that's one of those key phrases. The writer is trying to tell you they're going to be very rigorous, and they're going to use longitudinal data to test a particular hypothesis. And all of this just in the very first paragraph of the specific aim. So there's not pretty much a word that you could take out, and yet you understand completely what it's about. So this is why it's so important to choose the words carefully, to choose the logic of the sentences, and to make it as clear as quickly as possible what the focus of the grant is. Are there any questions about this particular example or other specific aims that you've all worked on?
Yes, there's a question. The question is, can you comment about writing in active versus passive voice?
I tend, I think you have to choose what you're comfortable with. To me, this is an active voice. I mean, maybe other people, because it's not we and us and my, it seems passive, but I think it's active. And this is the kind of language that I think is best. The only place in a grant that I can think of where, let's say, for example, the first person is usually the right thing to choose is in the training section of a K. But other than that, I don't spend a lot of time saying us and we and me, and you know, I try to be really simple and direct. I don't know if that answers the question.
Okay, there's another question. Is it better to start with the question as the first sentence, or can you state the overall objective in a statement?
Oh, I don't think you have to start with a question. I think this just happens to be an example, but no, absolutely not. You can start with a statement. But I do think, I mean, I believe not only in a grant, but in an article for a journal, that the first sentence has to tell you what the grant's going to be about or what the article is going to be about. And it can't be, oh, Alzheimer's disease is really bad and it costs a lot of money and blah, blah. It has to tell you right away what the topic of the grant is, because you're trying to, get the reader interested. And if they're reading your grant, then they know about the general things related to this area. They know about aging and Alzheimer's disease and health disparities and so on and so forth. So you want to take that first sentence and let the person know what it's about, but it certainly doesn't have to be a question.
I don't have any more questions
Okay.
that have come up yet.
So this is later in that specific aims from that grant, but it's the aims and hypothesis section. So now, in addition, this person has told you what the grant is about. Now they're saying they're going to use data from the Baltimore Longitudinal Study on Aging, taking advantage of the rich data that includes longitudinal measures of vision, neuroimaging, and a cognitive battery. So now you know what the domains of interest are. And aim 1, to define the longitudinal association between vision and cognitive function in older adults. And the hypotheses: reduced vision will be associated with lower executive functioning, memory, language test scores, greater declines in these cognitive tests, and increased risk of incident dementia. And this is just one of the aims, and the others, of course, have to do with the imaging, because that's already been mentioned, but this is just as an example. But again, you see this is really simple, declarative sentences, very clearly laying out what the hypotheses are. Any questions about this? Okay. So then every grant, even though it won't tell you anywhere, I don't think that it's important, but it will tell you that one of the criteria of the judgment on which the grant will be judged is innovation. So in general, I encourage people to have a section that's labeled innovation. And in this particular grant, it said this research will impact clinical care because improving our understanding of the vision-cognition relationship is a necessary first step toward improving current clinical care of older adults with vision loss. If our work suggests that the vision-cognition relationship is in part a result of downstream consequences of vision loss, then these results will implicate the benefits of ophthalmic interventions that go beyond the eye. Our results might further suggest that either treatment of vision loss or interventions aimed at encouraging cognitive engagement may stop or reverse the negative effects of vision loss, etc. So this is trying to say, obviously, not only am I going to do this work, but this work is important because it will lead to these innovations. And every grant really needs to have something like this that will allow people to see why it's valuable and where it might lead that would be important. Any questions about that?
So Marilyn, there's a question, two people raised the same question, and it wasn't necessarily related to the innovation. They want to know how to handle the hypothesis section for qualitative data aims.
Oh, it would be the same. If you're doing a qualitative data analysis, you must have a hypothesis about what you're going to learn from it. So it wouldn't be lower scores, but it would be what you would learn. This work will, I hypothesize that I will learn X, Y, and Z from doing this work. I don't see that it's different if it's qualitative. What are your thoughts, Roland?
I think, let me see, Yeah, I think you can have that setup, that framework, but the approaches I think are a little different. I'd like to hear from Joe on this because I know he's seen tons of these qualitative and mixed methods approaches.
What do you think, Joe?
I mean, usually you're exploring some area. So, I don't usually frame it in terms of a hypothesis, but, at some point you sort of lay out to the reviewer in a sentence or two that you don't usually have testable hypotheses when it's qualitative. It's more exploratory, right?
Right, but
But
you're hypothesizing you're going to learn something new, right?
yeah, well, but I guess I don't think of that as a hypothesis the way, people in an intervention will have a 5-point decline on the PHQ-9.
Mm-hmm.
That's a testable hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
I have something more controversial maybe on the hypotheses
Yeah.
idea, if I could ask you.
Yes, please.
It's, you're talking about space, the importance of the space you have
Mm-hmm.
in the grant. And that first page of the aims is so critical to grab the reviewer,
Right.
And I'm always puzzled. I'm not saying don't have hypotheses, okay?
Mm-hmm.
But I always wonder how much space gets taken
Yeah.
sometimes. And the reason I'm bringing it up is, let's say you say, we have an intervention for depression. Well, a lot of times it'll say, our intervention will decrease depression. First of all, that's not a hypothesis because it's not testable,
Mm-hmm.
right? It doesn't say PHQ-9 less than 5 or something like that. And the second thing is, it's kind of obvious. Like, you're not going to have an intervention and then say, we hypothesize people are going to get worse.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes it seems like a waste of space on the aims page. I mean, I get it for in the grant, but
Yeah. No, I completely understand where you're coming from, and I sometimes struggle with that myself. I guess what I try to have people do is have at least some very simple wording about the
yeah,
hypothesis that then can be elaborated on elsewhere in the grant.
right. I
And
mean,
I have on occasion thought maybe we could cut this out completely. We don't have enough room, and then thought that's not a good
yeah.
idea.
I mean, even in your example, right? Is it plausible to think that people with reduced vision are going to have better executive functioning, better memory, better,
Why not?
usually, I don't know. Well, I guess
It may not have lower, it may just be the same.
yeah, okay. I mean, I don't know if sometimes it's just disciplinary.
Yeah.
Certain disciplines are expecting to have that there. That's all.
Yeah, no, I understand. I understand. Well, I do think it's worth asking the question when you're writing it. Do I absolutely need to
Yeah.
have a hypothesis here? And if you think you can get away with it, sure. But you
But
have to have the aims, right?
the
Oh,
other
yeah, of course.
the other possibility is you can have a overarching hypothesis rather than, one hypothesis for each aim.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Yes. Yes, exactly right. All right. So let me just, I said something earlier about trying to synthesize things at various points to keep the reviewer on track. And this is an example. So this is in the research section under research approach, and it says overview of proposed research. And the overarching aim of the proposed research is to use a multi-domain approach to examine the association between visual function and neurocognitive outcomes in late life. The proposed research focuses on testing the sensory loss sequence pathway of this conceptual framework. It refers to a figure. However, if results do not support the sensory loss consequence hypothesis, meaning there is not a temporal relationship where vision loss precedes cognitive decline, then this would provide support for the common cause theory. Now, why this is so important in this particular grant is that this grant is a resubmission, and in the original critique, the question was, why don't you test more than one hypothesis? And the writer of this grant felt it was impossible to do that in one grant, that there wasn't time, it wasn't feasible, but they had to address what might happen if they didn't support this hypothesis. So this is a way of restating what the overall goal is, but also taking into account this critique that what if the hypothesis was not supported. Very, very quickly, an example of a preliminary research section. It's really critical in any grant to indicate that you have preliminary data that you have analyzed. And here it says the candidate analyzed data obtained under the BLSA vision protocol to examine, et cetera, although these analyses use non-standard measures of vision, the results suggest, et cetera. And in the grant, we are going to be using different measures, is essentially what this section is saying. So it's telling you right away that this applicant spent a lot of time analyzing data, that you're going to see the results of these data, and that they justify continuing to collect data, only data that's more refined, in order to address the questions at hand. And this introductory paragraph sort of helps you to know what's going to be coming in terms of the details of the preliminary data that you're going to be hearing about. Any questions about this? So it's not really necessary, and maybe it's wasting space. On the other hand, it's orienting the reviewer and keeping the reviewer on track, which is why I think it's valuable. So then there are always, as I said, you have to talk about the limitations and the strengths of the proposal. I'm not going to read through this, but you have to think very carefully about what you would say would be obvious to the reader about what the limitations might be. So in this particular grant, maybe you wouldn't see a change over 5 years, but if you had longer follow-up, you would. So that's addressed here. And again, this issue of not testing the alternate hypothesis as being some of the limitations. You want to talk about limitations that are clear. You want to obviously not answer them in a way that suggests that the grant is not worth doing, but you can't ignore them. You have to say what your other alternatives might be. So let me just stop there before going on, see if there are any other questions about these various sections and examples.
I have a brief question. Although you might be getting to it later, and you can just tell me you're going to get to it later, but at the beginning of the talk, you said leave enough time, and I was just curious if you had what is the enough time, in your opinion?
So I actually, the people who work with me, who work on Ks, get a long table listing all the sections that have to be completed, and I ask them to write down the dates at which various sections would be done, and I encourage them to take about 6 months. Of course, that's because there's, well, I think in general, it's because you need so many things from so many people. So I think one of the things to keep in mind in writing a grant is that it's not all up to you. So you're dependent on a lot of people for getting things, and then things don't happen the way you expect, and the things you get are incorrect. So I mean, I will come back to it later, Jeannie, but I do think, does that sound like a crazy amount of time?
Oh, to me, no. Although I will tell you that there's someone who will remain nameless who says they can write a grant in 40 hours. I've gotten that advice too, which I thought
Well, I have
Was
seen grants that people have written in 40 hours and they read like they've been written in 40 hours. You know, I mean, I think the big thing is that there's a big delay usually between writing a grant and having it reviewed and then finding out if it's funded. Getting it in is not the trick. You want to get it funded. And the only way to do that is to have everything be done really carefully.
Mm-hmm.
And
oh yeah, I'm not a proponent of the 40
yeah,
hour.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I just actually, just before I got on this call, somebody sent me a grant that they're working on that's going to be a supplement. And I could tell that he was using something he had written before because he kept referring to aging when the topic of our grant is Alzheimer's disease. It means that he just sort of threw it together, right? So that's what happens if you take 40 hours.
Yeah, and also depending on the types of grant, if it's all three, if it's a secondary data analysis, and how much control you have over writing the different sections, and
Right.
so that's going to be critical as well. But increasingly, that becomes less possible, even if you can do most of the things yourself. But always, I mean, it's nice to get other people to give you feedback. Even initially, you don't think that you need much help.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. And George is on this call, so he will know that our training grant renewal is due in the spring. And I'm going to start working on it soon, not because it's hard to write, but because we have to get so many things from other people, and it's so terribly hard to do that.
I was just thinking about that this past week, Marilyn. Realizing that's coming up.
All right, so just moving along. So I mentioned before that I really encourage people to pay attention to all sections of the grant, and that's related to what we've been saying in terms of time. So the budget, of course, you're going to live with a budget if the grant is funded, and so you want to be sure that it's okay. I spend an awful lot of time on the budget justification because I think these days you don't tend to get it cut, but it's an opportunity to give people more information about how the grant is going to be conducted. And sometimes it is actually supplemental information for the grant, and you can use it that way. The resources are obviously important so that people know that you have the facilities and resources to do the grant. I mentioned earlier this business about human subjects, and I'll come to an example of that. The letters of support, as I said, you really have to draft them because you have to be sure that they have all the critical information in them. And I spend a disgusting amount of time on bio sketches. People send bio sketches that are just horrible. And the introductory narrative, whatever you call it, the applicant information is often not relevant. Very often it doesn't have even a sentence in it that tells you that they know what the grant is about. Lots of times there are things that are inaccurate in it. And the main reason, well, if the narrative is bad, the reviewers will be unhappy. But if the other stuff is inaccurate, it will delay getting the grant reviewed internally. So it'll waste a lot of time. So each of these sections, I just spend time on. I don't see any way around it.
Marilyn, I just submitted a grant a few weeks ago, and one of the things that we noticed about the biosketches is how many of them were on the old forms.
Yes.
People didn't use the most recent form.
Yes.
And
I just got one today from this person who sent me the administrative supplement. I'm sure it's the old form. I'm sure that we're going to have to. And the ORA will just return it and waste your time.
That's right. Yeah.
So that's this first section here really is about that. So if you're a new investigator, like if you're starting out, that first narrative section is the very first thing the reviewer is going to read apart from the abstract. So you can't think of it as being pro forma. You're telling them who you are. and you're trying to tell them how your background is relevant to the work that you're doing. So it's not about the degrees that you've had, it's about the interests that you have and what's important to you. And you can think of that as talking to the reviewer to tell them who you are. And likewise, the scientific contributions, you should think really carefully about which ones you want to include. You're just supposed to have an overview, not details, but then no more than 4 citations per section. And I spend a lot of time in these terrible bio sketches fussing about PMC ID numbers, because grants can actually be rejected by the NIH if you don't have PMC ID numbers. There are times when it's out of your control, when you need to cite a grant and it should have a PMC ID number because it's been supported by federal money since 2008, and it doesn't, but you need to include it. But at least if you have it on some of them, then that's helpful. And in case any of you are confused, there is a thing called a PMID number. That's not the same. A PMC ID number means that the article is free to the general public. And it's very important to funding agencies. It's required by Congress, and that's why it's become such a big deal. And then most bio sketches at the end nowadays are supposed to have a completed grant, and I find half of the bio sketches I get, I have to send back because they don't have them, and ORA will just return them to us.
Marilyn?
Yeah.
Can I add something there? Because
Sure,
I'm a big bio sketch person too. Your articles up under the personal statements are numbered, and the articles up under your scientific contribution are small lowercase Arabic letters. And finally, you're required to have my NCBI link, not your Google Scholar link.
Yes, yes.
For your
yes,
and I
yes.
see tons of Google Scholar links, which is not required.
Yes, absolutely. And in the grant section, we're getting ready to submit a progress report for our Alzheimer's Center, and half the other supports that we've gotten, which are like bio sketches, have grants that end dates that are passed, and ORA will just send it back. We'll just waste time. So we've talked before about the protection of human subjects section. These headings are the headings that are stated usually in the various FOAs and RFAs. And I stick to them really religiously, because then I feel within that I can say whatever I want. So, for instance, if you're where it says human subjects involvement characteristics, design of clinical research, that gives you an opportunity to say an enormous amount and provide a lot of additional detail. And same way under study design and so on. So this is the kind of format that I use. And this is an example of the numbering system I mentioned earlier that I think reviewers find helpful. I used to not pay a lot of attention to these numbering systems, but I think reviewers really makes it much easier for them to follow the grant. And it actually, I think, makes it better for you it makes it seem more logical. So just sort of finishing up, this grant that I showed you earlier, as I said, didn't get funded the first time. The criticisms had to do with the fact that most of the work was going to be secondary data analysis, and this person was not going to have any experience with primary data collection. She was going to be using imaging data, but there was no real good training in imaging. They thought she should have more training in neuroscience of vision. And it was an odd critique that I don't think I've ever seen before, which was that all of her work had been at Hopkins and they didn't think her network of mentors was broad enough. And then there were some specific critiques about the research plan, I mentioned before about one hypothesis versus two, and then the way the MRI data was going to be collected, and then also whether or not she would have a sufficient number of subjects in a particular group, subjects with MCI. So she responded to each of these points, and I won't go through them, but she systematically described how she changed the application in response to these critiques. And the one point I would make is that your response to the summary statement can only be 1 page. So it can't be written the way you would write a response to a review of an article, where you respond to each and every point from each and every reviewer. You have to synthesize what the major issues are and what the most important issues are, and then how you responded to them. So just sort of finishing up, somebody mentioned before how, I guess it was Chin Lee, how important it was to get feedback. I always send out sections of grants to people to read. Doesn't matter how many times I've written them. It's really important to have somebody else look at them and see, because you know something so well, and you kind of can lose track of where it might not be clear. And so you don't have to send them the whole thing. You can send people certain sections and just ask them to concentrate on those particular sections. But you really need to get feedback, and you need to be self-critical. You know, we all love our ideas, but you have to say to yourself, does this make sense? Is it logical? Would somebody who wasn't so familiar with what I was doing think it was important? And then coming back to this issue that Jeannie raised about enough time, since you need preliminary data, you need to think about that a year in advance. And as I mentioned, I often recommend people 6 months in advance starting to write. Because you need to get feedback, you have to have enough time for that. You have all these documents you have to get from people, and they often get recirculated. And then all the administrative things, preparing the budget, looking at the bio sketches, getting sections for the resources and environment. It just always takes much, much longer than you think it's going to take. So let me end there. It's just about 2. So we have a little bit of time if you want for some questions. People have been very good about asking questions all along, so that's great. Anything else, Roland?
No, Marilyn, I don't see any. And I know some people had to jump off because they had to go to other meetings. I don't see any, but I'd like to say this was outstanding. I too learned some stuff as well from this, so that I could take for the grant that I'm writing in that's due in March. Although I have started writing it, Marilyn. So you'd be happy to know I have started writing it. You know, so I'm plugging away at it. So yeah, George, do you have anything else?
No, I just want to thank you, Marilyn. That was wonderful. It was extremely helpful. And I think even if you've been in grant writing for a while, I mean, there's always something new to learn. And really appreciate you, covering so many facets of this today. And thank you again. And we did record this session, so we'll be posting that. For those of you who want to go back and review some of these points, or for those of you who had to miss the session today, it will be posted.
And there's a PDF of the slides that people should be able to get access to.
Right, yes. And I also just wanted to mention our next professional development series session will be in January 8th at 1 p.m. And Dr. Patricia Jones, who is the director of the Office of Special Populations at NIA, will be our guest speaker. So I hope you all can attend that. Dr. Jones has been leading the efforts there at NIA in the science for eliminating health disparities. So it should be a great session. So please put that on your calendar. Again, it's January 8th at 1 p.m. Okay.
Have a good holiday, everybody.
Yeah, happy holidays.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Take
Be safe. Mask up.
Absolutely.